Something absolutely explosive is happening across America today because just days after a Somali elected official was arrested on gun charges, in fact, felony gun charges, and tied to a condemned drug house linked to a federal narcotics raid, the entire country is now watching federal agents uncover something that is way bigger than that. This is what started as one arrest in Maine has now detonated into a nationwide fraud probe linking COVID aid crime rings. I know, this is crazy, guys. Linking COVID aid crime rings, welfare schemes, money laundering, and the political corruption stretching from Minneapolis to Washington, D.C., folks. And President Donald J. Trump, he just dropped the hammer. In a very stunning move, the Trump administration has officially terminated TPS protections for Somali nationals, a policy reversal that sent shockwaves through immigrant communities already bracing for fallout of federal raids. Now, we're talking ICE deployments, billions of dollars in suspected taxpayer fraud here. And as this crackdown intensifies, protests are erupting across the country. Minnesota streets are packed, emotions are boiling, the media is panicking, Democratic officials are scrambling, and the federal prosecutors, they're openly saying that this may be the biggest welfare fraud enterprise in American history. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly how one arrest ignited a chain reaction, why the fraud probe has suddenly exploded nationwide, and what the rest of the TPS means for America's immigration future. Buckle up, folks, because what you're about to see the story that they never wanted you to connect. Hit the like button and subscribe. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is where everything detonated, because when federal agents in Maine arrested Somali leader, Somali city councilor Ilhan Osman, they weren't just picking up another local official. They were ripping the cover off of a powder keg. In fact, Osman was indicted on federal gun theft charges after investigators tied him to a condemned drug house where federal agents previously seized meth, fentanyl, cocaine, and firearms. And when reporters pressed him for proof of residency, well, let's just say that his lawyer claimed Osman was receiving death threats. Yet, police confirmed no such reports existed. None. But this is what really made Washington freeze. The arrest happened the exact same week that federal agencies were preparing new fraud indictments tied to Somali-run networks in Minnesota. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was a collision point. It was a spark landing on gasoline, and that is when agents realized this wasn't local corruption. This was the first domino. So within hours of Osman's arrest, federal investigators began connecting threads that they had previously treated as unrelated. So, fraud cases in Minneapolis, money laundering patterns in Maine, suspicious nonprofit transfers tied to COVID aid programs, housing schemes, autism therapy billing scams, welfare overpayments routed through these informal clan networks. Now, for years, officials wrote these cases off as isolated incidents, but Osman's arrest, tied to drugs, firearms, and a falsified address, set off some alarm bells. Suddenly, the same surnames, the same shell corporations, the same community organizations, and the same money routes kept showing up across federal databases. Intelligence analysts described this overlap as statistically impossible to be accidental. One DHS official said it plainly. This wasn't random crime. This was a system, a coordinated nationwide system hiding in plain sight. And the Osman arrest was the key that unlocked the entire structure. Now, before we move forward, let me just tell you something that really hit me hard this week. So a woman told me that she went to the hospital thinking that everything was covered, right? Right up until the bill came back for $1,400. Now, her Medicare plan covered the doctor, but not the specialist that walked in the room. So she told me the worst part wasn't even the money. It was picking up the phone and calling her daughter to ask for help. That really hurt. Nobody should ever have to make that call. And this is exactly why I partnered with Chapter, because they show you beforehand what your Medicare plan doesn't cover so that you're not blindsided when the bills hit your mailbox. Now, most people are already dialing the phone number at the bottom of your screen before it's too late, or they're visiting askchapter.org/Ron just to make sure that one surprise bill doesn't wreck their entire retirement. Or they're dialing the phone number at 909-563-8279. And speaking of real people, I just want to highlight one of the comments that genuinely made my day. So Ed wrote, saving $684 a year thanks to Ron and Chapter. Huge savings for this 84-year young senior on fixed income. Well, Ed, thank you so much. Stories like yours just remind everyone that's watching that these decisions really do matter and they change lives. Now, one federal analyst realized what they were looking at. The findings went straight to the White House, and President Donald J. Trump didn't hesitate. He ordered a nationwide sweep targeting every suspected COVID aid fraud ring tied to Somali networks and their affiliated organizations. Now, this wasn't symbolic. This wasn't political theater. This was the federal government finally admitting that billions, yes, billions were siphoned out of emergency pandemic programs or coordinated groups exploiting loopholes faster than agencies could close them. Now, Trump authorized multi-state task forces, DHS intelligence teams, IRS criminal investigators, and even DOJ prosecutors to combine efforts for the first time since the early pandemic fraud prosecutions. Now, one senior federal attorney described this new phase as the largest domestic fraud manhunt in U.S. history. And the most alarming part, every road that investigators followed kept leading back to Minneapolis-St. Paul. Now, before we go deeper, let me point out something that every one of us is dealing with right now. The rapid spread of information that's almost impossible to verify. Social media algorithms don't reward accuracy. They reward outrage. And this is why I use Ground News. It pulls in over 50,000 sources worldwide, and it shows you bias, factual ratings, and ownership all in one place. I mean, just take this one Somali fraud investigation story. Ground News shows that it's been covered by over 40 news outlets. Roughly 62% lean left, 38% lean right. One headline downplays the fraud, while another one highlights the billions that were stolen. I mean, you can compare every single angle instantly. I partner with Ground News because it helps people think clearly, see the blind spots, and understand what's really going on. So go to ground.news/Ron for 40% off of their Advantage plan, or you can scan this QR code on your screen right there and get that 40% off. Yeah. So what prosecutors uncovered in Minnesota shocked even seasoned investigators. The infamous Feeding Our Future scandal, where over $250 million was meant for hungry children, vanished into luxury cars, overseas transfers, and shell nonprofits, turned out to only be the surface layer. Wow, it was much deeper than that. In fact, beneath the surface sat an entire ecosystem of coordinated schemes: housing stabilization fraud, fake autism services, inflated daycare billing, fabricated food distribution reports, and a sprawling network of community organizations that, air quotes, that federal auditors now believe laundered billions of dollars. Agents discovered money that was flowing through these clan-based informal economies, crossing state lines, and even, according to intelligence briefings, moving overseas toward extremist link groups. Now, the fraud wasn't sloppy or accidental. It was structured, strategic, and years in the making. So one DHS report put it bluntly: the Minneapolis-St. Paul fraud network is the financial engine behind multiple national schemes, and Osman's arrest was the spark that made it all impossible to ignore. Now, here is where everything erupted nationally, because after seeing the scale of this fraud, the intelligence reports, the billions siphoned out of federal programs, President Trump, he made the call that Democrats swore he would never make, or at least never dare to make, but he did. TPS for Somali nationals terminated. Now, you need to understand that these temporary protected status was originally expanded under Biden as a shield for migrants who claimed that they couldn't safely return to Somalia. But federal investigators revealed widespread exploitation of TPS, duplicated identities, fraudulent asylum claims, individuals using their protected status while simultaneously funneling money abroad or participating in domestic fraud schemes. Trump's reversal instantly changed the legal landscape. Thousands who relied on TPS protections now faced new scrutiny, new interviews, new background checks, and in some cases, immediate deportation proceedings. The left called it cruelty, but law enforcement called it necessary, and the streets responded exactly as you would expect. Within minutes of Trump's TPS announcement, protests ignited from Minneapolis to Seattle to Columbus. I mean, crowds surged into the streets, chanting, blocking intersections, surrounding federal buildings. Activist groups claimed Trump was criminalizing immigrants, meanwhile ignoring the very fact that prosecutors were uncovering one of the largest welfare fraud networks in U.S. history. In Minnesota, lines of police formed around the federal courthouse as protesters hurled accusations of racism, shouted that Trump was targeting Somali identity, and waved signs demanding TPS reinstatement. Some demonstrations grew tense, to say the least. Fireworks thrown, traffic shut down, heated confrontations with counter-protesters. But beneath the slogans and the noise was a deeper panic. The fraud network was unraveling. Arrests were expected, deportation orders headquarters were prepared, and entire organizations built on taxpayer money were suddenly at risk of collapse. The chaos wasn't just emotional, it was strategic because the crackdown had finally arrived. And just when the Democrats thought that they could frame all of this as Trump attacking immigrants, the receipts dropped literally. Federal filings revealed that multiple Minnesota Democratic lawmakers took tens of thousands of dollars in campaign donations from individuals that are now charged in the Feeding Our Future fraud ring. Now, these weren't some small-time donors or some accidental contributions. These were key players in the alleged billion-dollar laundering operation that people are now facing indictments, plea deals, and wire fraud charges. So when reporters confronted the politicians, the excuses flew fast. We didn't know. It was a community outreach effort. We returned the donations once we learned the truth. Sure you did. But get this, voters didn't buy it, and neither did I. Did y'all buy it? Because when Democrat officials were shaking hands and cashing checks, the fraudsters were bleeding federal programs dry. This wasn't bad optics. This was a political explosion, proof that corruption didn't just hide in communities, it sat in campaign finance reports. And right on cue, legacy media launched into full-blown damage control mode. CNN, MSNBC, and the usual corporate outlets rolled out panels claiming Trump was weaponizing immigration enforcement. They downplayed the fraud. They deflected from the arrests. They questioned the motives of federal prosecutors, suggesting bias rather than acknowledging the mountains and mountains of evidence uncovered by investigators. So anchors called the raids controversial. The TPS termination was cruel, protests, understandable backlash. But what they didn't mention, the billions of dollars missing, the children who never received food. How about the taxpayer-funded programs that were exploited for years? So instead, they painted Somali networks as victims and Trump was painted as the aggressor. But here's the twist. The more that the media tried to bury the truth, the more the public began asking questions. If there was nothing there, if there's nothing to see here, right? Then why were they so desperate to hide it? And so as the investigations deepened, Somali American leaders stepped forward, not to address the fraud, not to condemn the corruption, but to deflect. So Ilhan Omar, appearing on CNN, insisted that the fraud was caused by program design flaws, claiming that agencies rushed to roll out aid during the pandemic, but didn't build enough guardrails. She never mentioned the stolen billions of dollars. She never acknowledged the organized network. She never addressed the cultural patterns identified by Somali scholars themselves, patterns involving clan loyalties, informal economies, and deeply ingrained distrust of government systems. Instead, leaders framed the entire scandal as this misunderstanding, or worse, a targeted political attack. But federal investigators disagreed. They had evidence. They had names, transfers, organized groups, repeated patterns across states. The clash became unmistakable. Identity politics versus accountability, narratives versus documented fraud, deflection versus reality. And the reality was getting harder to hide. And then came the moment that the country just could not ignore. Before sunrise, federal tactical teams rolled into Minneapolis, St. Paul. Armored vehicles, ICE enforcement units, Homeland Security agents armed with deportation orders, warrants, and intelligence packets that were detailing the plan, the key players in the fraud networks. Over 100 federal officers surged into the Twin Cities, targeting individuals with final removal orders and those that are tied to the criminal schemes uncovered in this nationwide probe. This wasn't random enforcement. This was coordinated, targeted, and long overdue. Residents watched from windows as agents raided properties, seized documents, questioned suspects, and took individuals into custody. Now, for some neighborhoods, this was the first time that they had realized the scale of what had been happening right under their noses. The media screamed, activists panicked, but prosecutors were unmoved. The crackdown had only just begun. Now, what happened next proved that this wasn't a Minnesota problem. As federal analysts traced these financial pathways, they uncovered in the Osmond arrest and the Minnesota fraud network, the same fingerprints appeared in Ohio and Washington and Maine and Colorado and even parts of Texas. Shell corporations, shell nonprofits with identical structures, overseas transfers routed through the same intermediaries, duplicate beneficiary lists, coordinated grant applications using recycled language. Federal briefings revealed that what America assumed were isolated COVID aid abuses, they were actually interconnected fraud rings. Money was moving with precision and speed. DHS analysts now believe that these networks may represent the largest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history, dwarfing anything previously uncovered. Governors demanded emergency updates, state agencies froze funding, federal prosecutors expanded indictments, and the nation suddenly saw the truth. The arrest in Maine wasn't an ending. It was the entry point of a national web finally exposed. And now America finds finds itself at a defining moment. For years, political correctness buried concerns about fraud, assimilation, and national security. Leaders were terrified of being called racist, xenophobic, or anti-immigrant. But December 2025 shattered that spell entirely. With billions missing, networks exposed, protests erupting, and TPS revoked, the public reached a breaking point, and President Trump stepped forward with a doctrine that resonated across the country. Enough is enough. This moment isn't just about one arrested official or even one fraud case. This is about the government finally confronting a system that exploited taxpayer generosity, manipulated identity politics, and operated with impunity. It's about restoring integrity to aid programs, protecting national security, and refusing to sacrifice truth for optics. And as the dust settles, one thing is unmistakably clear. America's eyes are wide open, and we're never going back.